Welcome back, book nerds. This is Library Card. I'm Megan Gliona. I'm here with Mr. Brian Brinkman and Mr. RJB, and we are the show for people who want to think deeply about the books we read and get inspired to read more. So today we're going to be talking about Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver. This popular book was a co-recipient of the 2023 Pulitzer Prize for Fiction. It's a very popular book. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. But before we do that, I want to check in, see what you guys are reading. RJ, how are you doing? What are you reading?
I'm doing great. Thank you for asking. It's Monday, so things were very Monday like before, but now we're here, so it's good. I'm great. I'm enjoying a lot of reading. That's what we're supposed to do, right?
Yeah, what are you reading?
I'm reading this book that I mentioned to you guys that I didn't start liking until like almost the end, which is interesting. But now I like it. It's called Hum. Um, and it's actually like not that. It's kind of an analog to Clara and the Sun in a way. It's like it's
Oh,
like kind of about the. It's from a human perspective. It's like a family story, but it's like about they live in this society where there are these things called hums that are like robots that are kind of like everywhere, and that's how you are identified, and that's how you like buy things by like touching the screen of this robot that walks around like to buy things from the equivalent of Amazon. It's like it's very dystopian, but also like doesn't seem that far in the future. So it's interesting, but it was like kind of slow, and then it picked up. So I'm enjoying it. I think I would recommend it, but give me like another day, and then I'll tell you if I would recommend it or not.
okay, we'll wait on that.
Yeah, I'm in
Brian, how
between.
about you? How are you doing? What are you reading?
I'm good. I just finished one of my favorite books of the year, The Safekeep,
Wow.
which you all recommended to me. I loved this book. I loved living in this book. I also loved, and similar to, I've had this realization the last couple of years that like the best movies are around 90 minutes long. And if you need more than 90 minutes, you really have to justify what you're looking for here. And with books, I think that like 250 pages is like the perfect length. You can get in, give us a character, give us a story, give us some background, give us a big conflict, and then resolve it. And then we can go on and we can move on to the next story. So many of these decide, no, I actually need 200 or 300 pages more because I really do. And this book was a perfect, slim, this book gave you tons of insights into people in post-war Holland. Um, Big focus on female protagonists, which is still an area that I am very light in and very inexperienced in, and so trying to better understand that half of the world and that half of the worldview. I loved this book. I thought it was amazing. I can't wait to talk about it at some point on this podcast. I'm also reading Beyond the Wall by Katja Hoyer, which is about East Germany, and I'm about three-quarters in. It is a fascinating read at how communism grew in Germany and then was exiled when the Nazis took over. And then all these people that were then uh, put into working camps and Stalinistic camps in the 30s and 40s came back after the fall of Hitler and created a German utopian communist society, and then what that looked like for the next 50 years. And I'm about halfway through it. It's very dismal, but it is very fascinating. So hey, that's where I'm at. That's where I'm at right now. What about you, Meg? What are you reading?
Well, I know very little about East Germany, but I did just watch that movie, The Lives of Others, which I
Mm,
highly recommend as like a window into East Germany. That was a good place for me to begin. I love to get history through movies, so that's kind of my lazy way of getting history. So you'll have
that
to
is
fill me in
next up
deeper
on
based on.
my that is next up on my watch list for my Criterion watches. That is there. You recommended it, and it fits with what I'm reading. So I'm really excited to check that out.
It's really good. Well, I just finished reading a book that RJ recommended. I finished Tom Robbins' Fierce Invalids Home from Hot Climates. Really terrible title, but it's a running joke in the book, so it works. But this was my first foray into Robbins, and he has such a wild and lush world. This book is about a CIA operative who is cursed by an Amazonian shaman, and it follows this operative's kind of nomadic journey with this huge heart he has kind of all over the world. He's loving women, he's loving young girls, he's loving adventure. His tone is like a marriage between Vonnegut and Gabriel Garcia Marquez. He has this very flowery language. It's really intoxicating, and the book is a totally wild ride. I think we're going to be talking about it on the podcast, so I'm excited to talk to you guys about that at some point. But I think we should. It's fascinating, and I can't believe I've gone so long without reading Robbins. It was really fun, and I just started a new book. Oh, go ahead, RJ.
I was just gonna say, now I feel bad. Like feel like maybe we should have done Skinny Legs and All, which is another great. Like they're equally good. And now I feel like, I mean, you enjoyed it, but
I loved it. But I think I chose this one out of the two.
Okay, good. Great.
So you shouldn't feel bad.
Great, perfect.
There is a lot. There's a lot of kind of like idealizing and talking about very young girls sexually a lot, which I think when you're younger and you read it, probably doesn't really matter. Like if you're like 22 and you're reading about a 15, 16-year-old girl sexually, it's like not that big of a deal. When you're in your 40s and you have a daughter who's 16, sometimes those things hit a little bit different. So that was the one thing that that's been a little bit of a challenge for me in Robbins, but I loved it. And I'll read another one for sure at some point. So I'll read the other one, definitely. But the other book I'm reading, I started yesterday, and it's called, this is what it looks like. It's called The Use of Photography by Annie Ernaux and Marc Marie. Ernaux is a French memoirist, and she won the Pulitzer in 2022. And that's kind of how I got, the Nobel Prize in 2022. And that's really how I got into her. A friend of mine introduced me to her, and because she won the Nobel, they started translating a bunch of her old works. And so they started publishing them in the US, and I got a lot of her stuff and got into her. And this book is super interesting. She wrote it with one of her lovers, another writer that she has a relationship with. And they would every morning wake up to all of their clothes all over the floor. And they started taking pictures of them. And it became these kind of artifacts of their lovemaking. And then they decided to curate them and write about them. And so they write about each picture, but they write about them separately. So you read her version and then his version, and it's absolutely beautiful and romantic. And they talk a lot about what's going on in their lives, right, as well then, and not just their relationship. And it's really creative and a super cool way to dive into memoir reading, but in a more kind of artistic and creative way.
Love it. It's amazing.
It's a pretty cool book.
Nice.
I would
That's
recommend.
cool.
Yeah, it's really
That's
cool.
fascinating.
Yeah, she's a genius, and also just really economical and direct in her writing. It's lovely.
More economical and direct writers, more.
Yeah.
More.
It's funny because I kind of like both. Like I love a Robbins or a Marquez, where you can get like lost in these super verbose, really rich worlds. And then I also I would say Kingsolver is kind of like that too. But then, yeah, sometimes you just it's just so clean and nice when you get something really, really direct and sparse.
Well, yes, and I will completely contradict what I just said throughout this episode because I bury the lead here. But I loved this book that we're going to talk about here today, and it is not incredible. It's direct in some ways, but it is there for the color, the flowery language, the diversions that you go down that you think are leading one way and then end up leading in many cases to the same destination that you went in the first place. But it's all worthwhile.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. This is such a great book. Let's just get into it. Demon Copperhead was like I mentioned at the beginning, it was a co-recipient of the Pulitzer Prize in 2023. It actually shared that award with Trust by Hernan Diaz, which I think we might talk about at some point too. This is the first time that two books shared this award in its history, which is very interesting. But this book is about a boy who is called Demon Copperhead, and he's born to a single mother in Appalachia. And this is his breathless story of him struggling to survive institutional poverty and opioid addiction and try to create a life amid so much ruin. And it's really inspired by Charles Dickens' David Copperfield. It's similar to that story in that it's a really sweeping political story, but this one gets really deep into the American South and thinks about how we have really abandoned the rural South and what that abandonment has done to the people there. And I thought it'd be really interesting to start today by talking about some of the controversy and criticism of Kingsolver in general and have that kind of launch us into the book. So she's been criticized for being overly political and writing about, quote, large issues. And I don't think it's unfair to call her a social realist because she does write about issues that depict lives of working people and social issues. But she's been called a liberal crusader. And critics have said it makes it hard to find issue with her writing because she's writing from the perspective of the disenfranchised. And that she writes that her fiction is really like dripping with empathy and focusing on science and thinking about kind of an over intellectualization of a lot of the issues. And she has seen these criticisms as sexism. As Kingsolver says, men are raised to have ambition, women are accused of it. I don't know from my perspective if it's sexism driving these attitudes towards her writing, but from my perspective, I think it's okay for a writer to have perspective and write about social issues. But I'm curious for you guys whether you see this as a negative in her work or in this book in particular.
I just want to say, first of all, this isn't the only Kingsolver that I've read, and from talking to my wife about it, who's read more, like this is not as out there in terms of really being overtly liberal as some of her other books.
Yeah.
But like, I mean, would people ever say that what you just described about George Orwell or Upton Sinclair or Ray Bradbury or like people who are
Exactly.
writing as like and a lot of the African American writers like Ralph Ellison and others, I mean, would people ever say that? Like, no, it's so
I've never heard it
stupid.
said about a man. Yeah.
I can't imagine someone being like, I really like George Orwell, but like, it's just like a little too liberal. Like, it's like that's not what it seems so clearly sexist to me. Like, it just doesn't seem fair.
Yeah.
But I mean, maybe I'm missing something because again, I haven't read her other books, and I think like my wife, who reads a lot, found some of like she thinks some of her books are kind of annoying. So I think that's
Mhm.
like fair, but to criticize her as an author because of her point of view and like it just doesn't seem like that happens for men. It just seems totally crazy to me. But I might be missing something. Am I missing a big part of it? I don't know, Brian. What do you think?
Well, I have this like crazy theory that everything that is ever made is in some ways political in nature. Like, even if you're not writing about politics, you're inherently speaking about politics because you don't have to write about it in that moment, you know? So, like,
Yeah.
I kind of take that criticism, regardless if it's sexism, to just be like that's like a non-starter to me. Like everything is going
Mhm.
to be political in some nature, and I think if you're going to write a story that goes this deep into economic challenges, drug addiction challenges, regional challenges, just in terms of location and being kind of cut off from the larger world, like we're talking about politics here. I had a similar experience to you, RJ, in the sense I've never read any other Kingsolver, but my wife is a huge fan, and we were talking about her. She actually, this is, if not her least favorite Kingsolver, one of her least favorite that she's read of hers. And part of it is that she read a lot of Kingsolver in college, and there was a lot of like self-realization and overcoming obstacles and overcoming, massive challenges that are inherent to a political system that really inspired her when she was in college. And when she read about this, her criticism was kind of leading down a path that I think we'll get into at some point as well. The just overtly hopeless nature of this book and of the subject of this book. And she found the best Kingsolver to have a little bit more hope and light at the end of it, whereas this one feels a lot of like, man, what else can go wrong for this person, and what else can go wrong for this society? But I think stepping back, like when I read this book, I was taken in the same way I wanted to be taken when in December 2016, I, like many other liberals, was like, what the hell is happening to our world right now. Oh, here's this really smart guy from Harvard who grew up in in Appalachia, who wrote a memoir about his childhood. And this book is going to explain everything, which was, of course, Hillbilly Elegy, which turned out to be one of the worst books I've ever read, and a great memoir if you want to be the vice president of the United States, apparently. This book, Demon Copperhead, was like, if you are looking for a good version of Hillbilly Elegy, here you have it. Like a much more
Mhm.
realistic, a much more colorful, a much more celebratory book about this region, even in spite of all the flaws and all of the challenges that the people that come from there deal with. So I found this book to be really enlightening, really illuminating. I've recommended it to a number of people based on, like, if you want to know what is happening in our country right now, this is a great narrative explanation for it. So I kind of just scoff. I swipe aside any sort of like too political in nature conversations, because I think all the books that we've just talked about that we're currently reading, they have some basis in politics, no matter what.
Yeah, it's so interesting, and especially that both of your wives have read a lot of Kingsolver, because I've also read a lot of Kingsolver, and it is interesting that maybe more women read her than men, which maybe just speaks to the fact that she's a female author. But um, I have found I do agree.
That sort of sexism is real.
I
Where it's
think
just like
that's
growing
yeah,
up, you're like, hey, this is who you should read versus I should read Hemingway or Fitzgerald. Like that
yeah,
happens when we're
exactly.
all like when we're all kind of figuring out who we read.
Yeah, we were talking about this offline a little bit because the English teacher that introduced me to Barbara Kingsolver was really fantastic, and she was a woman, and she was, introducing us to things like Thoreau and Emerson, but also really pushing a lot of female authors on us, like Toni Morrison and Barbara Kingsolver, and explaining that like these women haven't been canonized like the men have, and it forced me away from the male canon a little bit. Like, I think I decided that Hemingway was too sexist and misogynistic, and I wasn't going to read any more Hemingway after Farewell to Arms. And I would, and so I think I have missed some of the male canon, and then I've been kind of pushing this way instead. But yeah, the thing about Barbara Kingsolver is that I first read well, the book that really blew me away of hers was Prodigal Summer, and or I'm sorry, the Poisonwood Bible. And that book is this huge, sweeping book about this family, this missionary family that goes to the Congo. And it's all about like colonialism and, religious fanaticism and cultural arrogance. And it's an incredible character study, too, which is something I want to talk about in this book, how she's able to move plot and character at the same time, which I think is really challenging to do. But the the way that I saw her books is that I thought that that was really her best, and then the other books I've read from her, I've really loved. I love Lacuna, I love Prodigal Summer, but she has a couple books that are more recent that are very, like, super political. I guess Unsheltered is a book that's, like, kind of a direct response to the Trump era, and people really did not like that, from what I understand. I have not read it, but I think it is a little um, maybe a little preachy and condescending. I think I read her nonfiction book, Animal Vegetable Miracle, which is absolutely incredible. Her and her partner went back to the land and decided to like live off the land, and they make or grow everything they eat. They kill the animals they eat. But it is pretty preachy. Like at one point, there's a character, or not a character, but someone in the books. It's nonfiction, but her daughter has a friend over, and the daughter asks for like a banana, and it's like they're like, a banana? You can't have a banana. Like those come from so far away, and they're shipped here with labor. And so I think there is a tone of like, of condescension sometimes. And I think that she went through a phase of that. But to me, this book really steps outside of that.
I think that's something that is a fair criticism if it's there. And I think
Yeah.
it's something that writers, I think directors go through it. I mean, with this was a big conversation around the Oscars between Honora and The Brutalist. The Brutalist coming across as kind of in your face, very preachy. This is what this movie is about. Boom,
Mm.
boom, 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 boom. We're gonna, make sure that you understand it and that you know, there's no nuance. You get what this movie is about. Where Nora is this kind of like, uh, you know, it's very nuanced in a lot of ways. It feels like it's one story and then it becomes another story and then it ends in another story. And not to turn this into movie cast, but like the delivery is important. You know,
Mhm.
there one of the things that works for me about this book is that at no point did I feel like I was being preached to. At every
Yeah.
point, I felt like I need to know what's happening with this person as his life develops. And oh, by the way, this is filling in a lot of blank spaces that I've had about what it would be like to be raised in this environment or what it would be like to have dreams and aspirations. And every time you take one step towards those aspirations, six other things come to, push you back into a corner and screw your life up in ways you can't imagine. So I think that criticism can be 100% fair. I don't personally see that criticism for this book.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I don't
I thought it
either.
was totally, like, understated. Like, some of the reviews were like the villain in this book is, like, the Sackler family, and I'm like, I don't really, like, think I think that's people making connections on their own.
Sure.
That
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
don't
Yeah, yeah.
really they don't, like, really it's not really I mean, it's, like, pretty understated, I think.
Yeah,
Which is,
I agree. I was just gonna say, I think that she's definitely talking about institutional exploitation against the
yes.
individual in this book. Like she's talking about it in big pharma. She's talking about it in the coal industry. She's talking about it with the foster system. But I have never felt like this was a hit job on the farm and, on the Sackler family or anything like that. And, any ties to that is just because they are very responsible for what has happened in a lot of this. But I do think that the book, to me, is really driven so much by character development. But then she's also able to match that in a really thrilling plot. And I think that's something that she does really well that I think is really hard to do. I think most books are either character driven or plot driven, and I think she's got that both. Similar to how the Bee Sting, I think, both you're kind of reading for both things. You want to kind of know what's happening. I would say this one has more plot than the Bee Sting, but I think it's definitely something that she does well in the story.
Well, I think that RJ said something about the bee sting that has always stuck with me as kind of like the ideal space for a book to get into. And that's almost, I'm paraphrasing RJ here. So, but like, I don't care what happens to these characters. I just want to read about these characters. And I
Yeah,
felt that with
exactly.
this book, like from the moment I started reading about this kid born, uh, you know, he was born on like the floor of his trailer, right?
Yeah,
His
his
mother
mom
had
was
him there.
like, yeah, she was like barely able to get out of her like drug stupor to have him.
Right, like, from the moment that that happened, I was just like, "I'm committed to whatever happens to this kid's life. I don't care what it is," and what unfolded, I could never have predicted, and I enjoyed the whole ride even when it was really difficult. I have a question for you guys, just I think that this positioning of how we're having this conversation is interesting, and I was reading something this morning that, um, accused her of poverty porn, and
Mm.
more broadly accused her of, um, pushing this idea that drug abuse and lack of education in rural America, specifically in rural Appalachia, is a moral choice. Um, I'm curious if you guys got that. I personally did not get the sense that she was making an argument that people in the rural South are morally sane. I'm gonna take these drugs because my life is so horrible, regardless the ramifications, or I'm not gonna educate my children because I don't want them to necessarily learn big ideas. To me, it was more what you just said, Meg. It's a systemic, onslaught that is really hard to overcome when you don't have the resources to escape it, to find alternatives. But I'm curious, like, did you guys get that sense that she was making an argument that people are morally, you know, uh, askew by choosing opioids and choosing a lack of education?
I definitely did not. No, I think this to me, she's actually saying the opposite. To me, she's saying,
Right.
Look at what's
Yeah.
happened to this environment." And when I was in middle school and high school, I spent a few summers in Tennessee, and we were working at a community center there, volunteering. And I lived in Michigan in, middle class suburb, and I was in an area in Tennessee in the Appalachian Mountains with there were places where people had no indoor plumbing in their homes in 1993. There were places where people had to walk. This person I met walked 3 miles to their job at, like, a McDonald's on the highway, every day. Like, these are places where a lot of opportunities just do not exist. And the industries that have come in, she talks so much about the coal industry and how it has completely ravaged this area and then just leaves when it's done. And, you know, these communities have been left behind. And there are definitely political choices that are being made that further, you know, complicate their lives and make things worse. But
Right.
to me, that is a product, not a choice. And also, I think this whole book is an argument against that idea. Like that's insane to me that someone would think that. And like this book is
Totally.
literally explaining to you how this child is born in a place with no hope. And, you know, he has that quote. He says, anyone will tell you the born of this world are marked from the get out, win or lose. And there's just this survival instinct. To me, I found this book very hopeful because
Yeah.
to me, it was like the endurance and resilience of the human spirit against all
Mhm.
odds. And so I don't find this book hopeless at all. But
Yeah.
I feel that's interesting that it should be accused of that. I mean, she's from this area. She lives there now. I don't know if, you know, she's really exploiting it. RJ, what do you think?
Sounds like bullshit to me. I
Yeah,
mean,
exactly.
she also, like, you know, the recent news, she like gave a bunch of money to start a treatment center. I mean,
She took all the profits from this book, not some, all of the
oh,
profits from this
all?
book,
They were
and
all? Yeah, I mean,
started a women's treatment center that
yeah.
opened its doors. And yeah, she's no joke. She's
Yeah, so
giving
what else
back.
do you need to know?
I mean, come on.
I do think this is about like the kind of resilience of the human spirit, you know, and in a lot of ways. That's my takeaway from the book. Um, even though like
Yeah.
the plot is totally depressing, you know, but I think
Yeah,
that's what allows it to work because of the contrast between like what's happening and what the fact that like he kind of continues on, you know.
Well,
It's
and I
pretty
really
crazy.
wondered to that point, like what it was like writing this book, because you're absolutely right, RJ. This is a very depressing plot, but without spoiling the end, the finale of this book does offer a significant amount of hope going forward. Now, part of the challenge is you've just read a 500-page book where every time there was a glimmer of hope, something even worse happened. So
terrible
you're kind of
happens.
like you're left being like, "Well, is he gonna be okay? What's gonna happen here?" Um, but I think I would be fascinated to know what it was like for her when she would leave the writing desk because she had to, like, you know, create these scenes that were full of life, so colorful, so many characters intertwined, characters who are evolving as you're reading the book and growing through childhood into adolescence, and like you're actually feeling them grow through childhood and as adolescence, and these genuinely fun and hilarious moments, all clouded by some of the darkest, most hopeless modern civilization that you could imagine living in. And like, how did she juxtapose this in a way that meant that literally every time I was doing anything other than reading this book for the time it took me to read, I was like, can I steal 5 minutes just to read a couple pages? Like, this was one of
Yeah.
those
Mhm.
books. I think it's very
Yeah.
important to hammer home. There are a lot of books that we read that you're kind of like, I got to get through this. I got to keep doing this. I got to keep going. There are those rare books where like I have it with me at all times. And if I have like 10 minutes between meetings, or if I'm sitting in the doctor's office, or if like my kids are downstairs and they're like, we're building a puzzle, you stay upstairs, dad. Like, I'm reading this book, you know, and like that is a very, very special thing that to do that within the context of what she's writing about is really hard.
Absolutely. She's an
Yeah.
incredible writer. I mean, regardless of what anyone wants to say about her politics or her tone in delivering that, I think her writing is so spectacular. She is able to build momentum and pacing in a way that I find absolutely thrilling. I think this book it rolls on. And I think that contributes a lot to what you're saying, Brian, about just like wanting to keep reading it.
I think the one thing we should talk about is just the writing style and how it evolves with the character's age and amount
Mhm.
Yeah.
of education. I mean, that maybe it's like easier than I think, but it seems hard. And
Yeah,
it's, you know, his voice, the character's voice evolves as he gets older and more educated. And that's like that's just a cool way to kind of construct a story like this, because you're seeing him become more aware of like both the positive and negative sides of life. I think it's like a really enlightening book in that way, because it gives you like the opportunity to experience this kid's life through his voice, because his voice changes, and I think that's like I think that's hard to do, and I think it's something I haven't really seen it talked about much in terms of like reviews. I think it's a really cool way to allow you a closer kind of look at this person's life.
Absolutely. I think in the same way that we were talking about Marie being so good at writing teenage girls in, or a girl in Cass in Bee Sting, she's able to write this teenage boy in such a believable way. I have no idea who she talked to or, who she interviewed or how she got that, but I agree. I think his voice is really strong and you feel like you know him really, really well pretty quickly. And the fact that you can also believe it as he grows and changes so much is truly spectacular. I'm trying to think of another book that I've read that's like that. It's, there's not many books where there's just kind of one character that's the driving force and the main thing that's everything's happening to. I think it's pretty cool that she has such a tight focus in a way, but then can also write such a grand novel.
Yeah, and I think I think about that, like, just in contrast to the Bee Sting, that the characters in Bee Sting are, he did a great job of kind of switching perspectives and voices, especially with Melda, and the teenagers, but they don't really evolve, right? So like, and I'm not saying that's
Right.
easy to do, but you're seeing that in a kind of static way from each character, which is seems impossible again, but this is like to kind of change the way that you're telling the story while you're going, just seems like a huge accomplishment.
Well, and I think also with the bee sting, especially for the two parents, you're jumping to like very specific points in their life.
Mhm.
Whereas here is this constant rolling evolution of him from what, like age 6 to age 18, something in that sort of range. And you imagine like, I mean, I have a 9-year-old son who at 6 years old was a very different person in a lot of ways. Like in
Mhm.
3 years, he's going to be, a different person again. Like 9 to 18, you are just like going through so much evolution and change. And by the time you reach 18, you're in some ways a completely different person. And at no point did I like, and I feel like you get these characters in like a lot of like young adult books, and
Mm.
like YA fiction where you're following a kid growing up, but it's told and written for kids to read and for young readers to read.
Yeah.
This is for adults where you are tasked with making us relate to someone as they're going through puberty and as they're going into high school and as they're changing. And you've known this character from their origins when they were in kindergarten. Like that's a very complex task to take on. And at no point was I like, whatever dialogue she used at 13, like that's not really realistic. Like the whole time I
Yeah.
felt like this was just a kid, just kind of like speaking stream of consciousness to me throughout the entirety of it.
Yeah, it to me that is one thing that she does so well, and I think that it's it's funny because I read somewhere that people one of the criticisms of the book was that he was a passive character, so that things happened to him and that he didn't like instigate things to happen, which I think is confusing to me on a lot of different ways. But I was thinking about it as like an exercise to think about it, like, is this really something that is a problem with the book or the character? But I think that that's also what is true of all children, right? Like,
And
aren't
that's where my
children
head goes.
just passive? Like, they're a little bit, until you're like a teenager, you're really kind of just on the ship. And I would say once he is a teenager, and even through like when he's, I think the things that he starts making decisions, but even those are influenced by, this opioid addiction that he develops. So it's hard to say, but I think most of the things that are happening to him are happening to him because he's a child.
I think that she builds a case, and I think that's maybe where people have issues with it that I don't personally have, is I think she builds a case that part of the victimization of this part of the country is that there are these massive industries that can come in that can appeal to these citizens with job security, with something to soothe your pain, and the alternative or the consequence of these things coming into this society is pretty negative. And that these are people without a lot of options, without a lot of opportunity, perhaps a lot of brain drain. And I guess like you can build an argument that that is the poverty porn aspect, that is the victimization of these people, and not giving them any sort of agency to change. But I think it also is a
Right.
reflection of the reality. And I think that positioning this, to your point, through a child who is simply just born into this world and is experiencing it, the interesting thing to me is like when he starts to reach a point of agency and of making choices, you do see him start to repeat a lot of the same mistakes that people that came before him, where there's a quick solution to this problem I have, because the problem I have will potentially destroy all opportunity and all potential I have as a person. So I'll take the quick solution. And then that has these devastating consequences on the other side. Now, is he too passive in making that decision? It's really hard for me to say because yeah, I can't totally relate to the experience that he had growing up
Yeah.
and the choices that he's had, but also I do think he's also making these decisions in a way that you would anticipate a young adult making these decisions if they're left to their own devices. Like he doesn't have any parents who are like, you probably shouldn't take oxycodone for your knee. You should get surgery and sit out the football season.
Yeah,
Sorry for the spoiler
exactly.
alert.
No, I think it's a really good point about the victimization, because I think that is an issue here. People view that this way, and I don't think she's trying to paint that at all either. And the more I think about it, he's not a passive character either. He goes to find his grandmother, right? He goes on that like
Yeah.
adventure to find his grandmother,
Great
and that
point.
leads to like a whole world with the coach and everything.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. I don't understand. I mean, obviously, I don't understand any criticism of this book because I think it's an amazing book. So, maybe it's just me, but I'm really like I agree with what you just said, Megan, which is like he's obviously he's I don't understand how you could see it as a passive character in any sense, really. So I don't know. Maybe I'm just not a good person to talk to about this particular aspect because I just don't think I don't think there's really anything that she did wrong here.
Well, can I ask something else? Because I think we've spent a lot of time defending this book against
Yeah.
ghosts right now. And I think it's fair because I think that the criticism of this book does open a lot of interesting questions about it. But one thing I was thinking about that this book does really well, it's very and she's very, I don't know if this is intentional or if this is just like where she went with the writing, but she does an amazing job of celebrating what makes this part of the country special.
Mhm.
And part of the reason I've recommended this to people as like a explanation of what is going on right now in our country is there are moments at like parties, at funerals, at certain at football games, at these communal events where you get the exact same sense that we all get when we go to communal events in our neighborhoods and in our paths of life. And this idea that like in rural Appalachia, you're so far off the beaten path that you can kind of do anything at these parties, and like there are no rules, and that there's a thrill to that. And there's something about being in rural America and being so far away from, the idea of the federal government's reach, the idea of like mainstream culture reaching you, that a lot of things that are off limits elsewhere are totally good here. And you get this real sense reading this book that like someone like Demon sees an opportunity for himself and sees so much of his surroundings that are holding him back. But at the same time, his entire culture, his entire community is all right here. And that culture and that community feels like home. And I feel like that celebration is a really interesting aspect of this book that I think if she hadn't had that, this would be a much darker and much more sinister political book.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, the people that help him are the community, his aunt, the grandmother, the coach. There are people in this community that are very close and tied to each other. And I think that you think about how his life would have been if he wasn't helped by that community, and it would have been even worse. I think even like the Peggotts, that family that take him in, and another thing they do well, she does so well in this book, is all the names. I just have to say really quickly the names of this book, like Demon, she's got Maggot, Fast Forward, U-Haul, Angus. She has some killer character names in these books. A lot of them are directly pulled, not those, but a lot of the other ones are directly pulled from Copperfield. But she has some incredible names in this book. But I think that she's really making a point about um, people gain resilience by being helped. And Demon is this person that we find out later in the book is this artist, and he's kind of like getting to that as a way of self-expression and a way to manage what's happened to him. And I think that the fact that he was like started, we were just talking about this a little bit before, that was kind of inspired to draw by someone who had a lot of issues in the book, and then eventually it becomes like his reason of being, and he's going to be writing and drawing about his home and telling people the stories of his home. And so I think there is a resiliency born out of this community that I think she is making point on. I agree.
Yeah, I mean the one of the amazing things about this book, I think, is how each of those characters that is there to help him, like you said earlier, Brian, you kind of like multiple times in this book, 10 times, maybe more, you get to the point where you're like, there's this good situation that he's in, and you're like, great,
It's going to go bad.
like it's gonna go bad, but in the time where he's in this situation, you're like, oh, finally, he's like back in like a situation with someone who's looking out for him or someone who can take care of him or whatever, and then like it's going to end, but every time it's like a relief, that he's found someplace where someone cares about him or can give him a place to live or whatever.
Yeah.
And that's just like really good plot development, because you could just be like it could become trite after a while, right? Because that's the whole, like, over and over again that like he's going to continue to be disappointed by the world. And if it wasn't written as well, it would just become kind of dumb by the end, because you're like, okay, another like situation that he's in that he won't get out of. But it never loses that kind of momentum, and it's pretty amazing.
Well, I think that it doesn't lose it because she's doing it really realistically, and she's making each of those, it's almost like she's having like a little oases in between like the struggle, and each one is interesting and different, and there's like a new thread of hope in it. And like I think a lot about the love story in the book, his first real love with Dory, and that is the saddest part of the book for me. And as someone who did love someone who developed a heroin addiction, that she depicted that so authentically, and how desperate that can feel and sad when you see someone you love doing something like that to themselves, and the helplessness that you feel, and how you almost just decide to do it to yourself too, because there's this feeling of like wanting to be with that other person so bad that you're willing to do something that would potentially hurt you just to be with them. And I found that part so unbelievably sad, but there was like this hopefulness about it because it was a real connection that he had. And then to watch her fade away from that and just kind of dissipate in front of his eyes was, I found, completely gutting. That was so sad.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean that part was really intense. I think it shows as well, kind of like thematically, the challenges one must have coming from a really impoverished place, wherever it may be in the world, that you have these connections on a human to human level. And how do you abandon them in
Yeah.
pursuit of your own goals and your own, better in your own life? And you think about the character like Dory, she was very much of um, a signifier that he had his shit together and he was on the right path and he was doing what he needed to do, and he was following his own physical gifts and talents and his own motivation. I mean, that whole segment with her and with him getting addicted to painkillers is really this like pure motivation to listen to your smart elders who tell you just like keep practicing, keep drawing, keep doing this, stay dedicated. Good things are going to happen. He has the reaffirmation of the school absolutely loving his performance. He's able to put people on his back. These are all like positive things. And he's loving this person even in spite of the fact that, from a health standpoint, it's not beneficial to her, it's not beneficial to him. Um, and so he's going through all these challenges, and at the same time, every decision he's making is leading him down a darker and darker path that he almost can't control. And so, like, again, that goes back to, is he a passive character? I don't know. Like, would you have done anything differently if like you were born into this horrendous existence and you stumbled upon a talent for drawing and playing football, and those were your opportunities to break out of the challenges, and then you reach this kind of initial dead end, but oh wait, there's a path around this. There's an opportunity for you to overcome this and not feel the pain. But what does that lead to? It puts you in the position of wondering, like, would you have actually done anything differently if you were in his shoes?
Yeah, I think that's kind of, where this criticism really breaks down is like, okay, well then, show me what you don't have done differently. It's a little bit
Yeah.
ridiculous. So I have a
Yeah.
question for both of you about, so the more I read about this book, I've never read David Copperfield. Have either of you ever read that book?
Nope.
I have not.
Yeah.
I've
So
read I've read some Dickens, not this.
yeah, I've never actually read Dickens. Besides A Christmas Carol, because I did the musical for like 4 years in a row. So, I had to read it then. But this book is very closely inspired by it, like very closely. Like there's um characters' names that are taken from it. The reason she decided to write it from the perspective of a child is because she went to an Airbnb, where he wrote most of Dickens of Copperfield, and she said she kind of met with like the ghost of Dickens, and he said to tell this story from the perspective of a child, and that was like her idea. That's how she was inspired to write it. Um, there's so many parallels to it, and I was wondering if you know that a work of art has been inspired really closely by another piece of art, does that affect how you feel about that art?
I think of this in the exact same way I think of the political criticism. I think all art has some inspiration in some other art. I'm actually I didn't include this in my list at the top, so apologies for me looping back to segment 1 and just expanding upon this, but I just read this over lunch today. I'm reading Quentin Tarantino's Cinema Speculation, and one thing he was talking about is, New Hollywood in the '70s, and that there had become this trend in Hollywood in the '50s and '60s to just take Broadway musicals and put them on the screen, and they sold a ton of money, or they sold a ton of tickets, they won a ton of awards, and these new directors came in and said there's stuff to update these old stories that were told in the '30s, '40s, and '50s, but in a new story. And I'm kind of the mindset like, how many different stories are there out there? Like, at the end of the day, there's
Yeah.
like various pathways that you can take for a story, and what it really comes down to is the originality with which you bring across characters, which with you bring across like getting from one plot point to another. So I don't personally have an issue with it. I think that I wish more modern literature and more modern movies were kind of updates on past stories in a modern tone. I think that's a really effective piece. And it also puts you in a position that you read a book like this and then you say, okay, I should probably go back and read David Copperfield because I enjoyed this and I want to figure out where the original text was and then where was Dickens inspired from and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I agree. How about you, RJ?
Yeah, I mean, it seems harder to me to do this than to like just do a story that you come up with, you know?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
so I don't know. My like it's not like she's like recreating Franzen or something, you know? I mean, it's like it's Dickens. It's like it's
Yeah.
kind of like I mean, I was going to say it's almost not like literature. I mean, it is, but it's like it's like recreating it's like telling a cool, interesting story from like the Bible in a way, you know?
Yeah, yeah,
Like
really
Yeah.
old text.
Yeah, I think that's
Yeah,
fair.
yeah. Mhm.
which would
Yeah.
be really hard to do without it seeming trite or kind of like predictable, you know? And I think that's what's like so amazing about this book is like you can have that reference point, and obviously a lot of people have read David Copperfield who've read this book, and it's still people still really really love it. So I feel like it's even more of an accomplishment. But now I'm like just I'm not. It's not even useful because I'm just telling you guys more and more about how much I love it. But
No, I think this is very helpful, and I agree. I mean, I tend to like when I first saw how close it was aligned. My initial reaction was, oh, so like this is like very similar, and is that cheating in a way, right? But then the
mhm,
more I was thinking about it, I was thinking about how one of my biggest problems with society right now is we don't know our history and we don't know our stories. And the value of taking a story where you have a child in England who is born impoverished and rises up. I mean, it's his own story, right? It's Charles Dickens' own story, basically. And that is such an important story because we learn so much about England and during that time. Whereas here we have a story that's going to teach future generations about what was going on in America in the South during this time. And so, yeah, I think if you can find a story that can translate, that's historical, that can translate and teach future people something about what's going on here, like that to me is genius. And also, as someone who writes basically based on inspiration, like almost every poem that I have ever written is because of like 2 or 3 words or a phrase that I've read in a piece of fiction. So it's
yeah,
like, that's like to
kind
me,
of the whole
I
point of
it's
art,
kind of the whole
really.
point, right? Is like no one makes art without a reference to other art. Like it's not, it doesn't, we can't because we've been living in a world with art. And so I think that, yeah, I think what you're saying is true. Like to be able to do it and do it effectively is super powerful. But yeah, I think those criticisms are all crap. And it's interesting the more we kind of dive into this to see how much of the criticism is really kind of ridiculous. And, it does make me think that there's a lot more behind it. And I'm curious as to why she's not a critical darling when she writes this well. Maybe she's
Yeah,
a white middle-aged woman, writing about the problems of the world. Nobody wants to hear it. I don't know, but
I
that's
mean, I
probably
think
part of
of
it.
her. Yeah, I think that's part of it. I think of her similar to Franzen in the sense that I think there's a perception of liberal elitism,
mm,
skilled with a pen, and these are not my words, but like a almost like manipulation of challenges that people deal with in recent modern America. Um, Personally, I think the alternative of you not reading authors like this and not getting this sort of perspective is just not having like that understanding of one person's point of view that tends to be a collective point of view of mass challenges that people are dealing with from a domestic standpoint and from a societal standpoint. Um, is there out there a book that is less middle-aged white author writing about the problems of the rural South? Maybe. I'm down to read it. I personally think of this as a win for society that we have a middle-aged white woman that is capable of writing these stories. Like, I
Mhm.
don't understand how that's a negative. And if that's your stopping point, there's a lot of books out there to read. And so maybe there are books that I should read based on enjoying this. And I'm here for all of those recommendations. I think that if the criticism is that she shouldn't have written this book because of her lone lived experience and because there is a empathy she shows to someone that doesn't necessarily get a lot of empathy in modern American art, that's a ridiculous criticism that I just can't. I don't really have time for. I don't really find a ton of value in.
Yeah. I mean,
Do
I
any of
think,
you go ahead, RJ?
well, I was just gonna say, I think like the interesting thing to me about like what you were saying, Brian, about kind of the commentary about the South is that like the public understanding, and I think it's generally true about rural Appalachia, is that it's like mostly white, and it's like if you want to read about the South, like if she was talking about, you know, like Mississippi or communities that are like much different than what she had experienced personally, like it might be a little bit different, but she's
Mhm.
really talking about, this part of white America that is so, you know, difficult for people to understand for a lot of reasons. And I think to me that's like a real service that the book does is like is kind of shining a light on it through a way in a way that she has experience with. It doesn't
Really
feel
good
like she's
point.
like an imposter in some way, which I think is, um,
Right.
like it feels very authentic to that.
Yeah, and I always come back to like the scenes that made me think that this feels like a really fun place to be. Like there are these like moments where you're like, wow, like look at this community, look at this party that's happening, look at the Friday night football feel. And she does a great job of like, there's no scolding on her behalf. That like, well, if you didn't
Mhm.
just care, if you didn't only care about your high school football team, maybe you could all get yourself together and, you know, eradicate drugs from from the Appalachian part of America. Like she writes this all with an immense sense of empathy and understanding that these are people living their lives day to day, and a lot of them just like us in our day-to-day lives, like we don't have the big picture of the total context of what we're living in and the challenges of what we're living in. We're trying to make life better for our kids, we're trying to continue to work, we're trying to have a little bit of fun here and there, connect with other people. Like if I blocked all of those things out of my life, I could probably accomplish more, and I could probably like raise the economic status of my kin for the next generation. But like, I also want to live my life and enjoy it. And I think she does just such a great job of balancing, all of that throughout the book.
Do either of you have a lasting image from the book?
Oh man.
Too many. Um, I think that the lasting image, I when I was thinking about this question, I feel like I can smell the trailers that
Mm.
Demon lived in. I can smell the unkempt rooms. I can feel how cold everything is in like unheated homes. I felt like I was lost in the maze of craggly two-lane highways going up and down valleys. Um, like when I think about this book, it's this kind of collection of senses in a way that's
Mm.
very different from the last book that we talked about, where like I saw something visually. With this book, like I feel a true sense of I was actually physically here. And that's a huge accomplishment to me as a writer.
Yeah, she's so good at that. To me, when I did spend time in Tennessee, it was always summer, but it was always so humid. And so I always was thinking about the humidity when I was reading this book and just what the South can feel like. To me, this book is wildly cinematic. And I have, when I close my eyes and think about this book, there's a bunch of different settings that kind of come to mind. I can see really clearly Coach's house. I can see a lot of the time that like when Dory and Demon were in the car together doing drugs, that for some reason that really hit me as a teenager that grew up in suburbia. I spent a lot of time in cars as a teenager, and I think that is like very authentic how they're when he has a car and they're in a car, it's just a very teenage way to live your life. It's kind of like a space you have that's your own. I also felt like a lot of the woods, I really kind of imagined, wow, like the party that they have, the big parties that are like by the ravine. And yeah, I felt like I could really picture, and it felt kind of like dark, very lush, and very humid.
Yeah, I think I agree with both of you guys. I think like that the walk that he was on to the along the highway, that's
Yeah.
like it's definitely like a
Yeah.
scene that I'll remember. And just the kind of squalor of the living conditions throughout, but especially when it was just him and his girlfriend. What was her name?
Dory.
Dory.
Dory. Yeah, that was like really bad and really memorable. Um Crazy.
Yeah, she's
Megan,
like, mhm.
well, sorry, I just have a question for you, which is how do you feel about this like shared Pulitzer situation?
I really don't understand it. Like, it's a prize. You have to pick one winner, no? I mean, I
Think
think,
so.
yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, it's
But
it's
it's almost like a
interesting.
political thing, right? Like they were like it's kind of like two separate views on like money kind
Yeah,
of,
it's true
right?
because yeah, like these books. So I was reading about the Pulitzer, and I didn't realize it's about like this Pulitzer Prize for fiction is about American fiction, and these two books. I mean, I read them both in the same year, and this book to me is much more well written than Trust. I think Trust is fascinating, and I didn't like a large part of it, but there's also I have not stopped thinking about that book, and that is always a really good sign of a book. But I think that there's a I don't know, that book is pretty fascinating, but it's right, it's such a different end. It's about wealthy people, and this book is about, impoverished people. And I do think it's interesting. I also think it's annoying because it's like, I don't know, it just feels like you should choose a winner. And it does, I don't know. If I was her, I might feel like that was a little sexist as well. I got to be honest. Like, I might be like, oh, okay, so I can't even win the fucking Pulitzer. I got to share it with a guy, Like, I don't know. I don't know.
How would you feel last night if Honora and The Brutalist both won Best Picture?
I
Co best
actually might be
picture.
happy about that, but I'm more happy that Honora won. As you know, I'm a huge Honora stan, and this is like my favorite movie of all last year. But I would have been okay with that. I would have been really okay with Brody and Timothy winning together, sharing the Best Actor prize. That would have been really great for me.
That would have been a lot of stop the music. I still have more to speak vibes on stage, even
Yes,
more.
exactly.
I have a question for you guys, just because the criticism around this book feels like it comes from a uh like one area of like
Yes.
this lived experience sentiment that unless you've lived, who are you to write about it? And I'm curious because I don't have any examples of this offhand of like someone from rural deep red America writing their own epic story about white collar liberal America. And if there's something out there, I'd be fascinated to read it. But like,
That'd be
would you
sick.
be would you be comfortable with a book like that describing your life, describing your existence, making some sort of criticisms, but also like celebrating the great qualities of the lives that we lead? Like because I feel like that's where this is rooted, is like we shouldn't touch this. This isn't ours
Yeah.
to touch. I don't know what you guys think about that.
I'm trying to imagine because so Kingsolver was born there and then moved away, became a famous writer, moved back. Um, so in a way she is authentically from there, but I'm fascinated by this idea because would there even be someone that was born in New York City, move to the South, and then write kind of a scathing look at New York City potentially? Um, I don't know. It that's interesting, and I think there's a reason. I don't know. I'm confused about this because I think like when I'm thinking about it, I'm thinking about someone who writes about like I think Franzen does a really good job of writing about kind of the challenges in middle America. And I think also like thinking about the author of Fleischman is in Trouble. What's her name? I can't remember her last name.
It's on tip of my tongue.
Yeah. Anyway, I think she writes a lot about like, like the anxious liberal elitist kind of cohort. So, but I imagine she is one. I can't imagine she wouldn't be. But I'm fascinated by this idea of if someone would write about liberal America that wasn't in it. That's very interesting. What do you think, RJ? This question stumped me.
Yeah. I don't know. Maybe we should try.
If
See
the
what
book was
happens.
good, I'd be into it.
Well, I think that empathy is what it comes down to.
Yes.
I don't think she's writing like I think that the thing that makes this book really work is that she is clearly writing in an empathetic tone about someone that she may abstractly understand based on where she was born, but probably isn't living around. And I think that to me is the key in all art. Are you empathetic about your characters or not?
I think like the equivalent of this for me would be like writing something about how everyone in Ohio, like the industrial, basically all the companies moved away, and all the union Democrats that I knew and who I was related to all became Trumpers. And like, could I do that? I definitely, it's all real, but could I do that in a way that doesn't just make it seem like I have a very specific, perspective on that?
on it.
Yeah, I don't know. Seems like it'd be harder. Like the closer you are to it, the harder it is to kind of like, be somewhat objective about it. But it's really interesting.
Well, RJ, I have an interesting comp to this book based on your comment there, which is Ohio's Stephen Markley. The book is called Ohio. The author is Stephen Markley, which I read about 2 years ago, which is about Ohio in the 2000s and early 2010s in the rural parts of the state as it is undergoing. Ohio used to be the bellwether. Where is the president going to be? Is it going to be blue? Is it going to be red? Oh my goodness, Ohio went red, so of course it's red. That no longer exists anymore. And a lot of that book is about that transition. It's written by someone who's originally from there. So you kind of do end up getting that. I thought that was a very great book as well. I would recommend to people if they liked Demon Copperhead to read that. But I don't know. It's interesting. It was just something I was thinking about when we were stewing over the idea of, um, you know, uh, any sort of criticism around this book. Like, what would the other shoe look like here?
Well, and also, we don't just get to tell our stories. We get to tell stories that we're inspired by. And, I think we're talking a lot about movies because the Oscars were last night, but Sean Baker, that was not his story of a sex worker in Brighton Beach. That's not who he is. He's not from Brighton Beach. He's not a sex worker. But he's still telling this story because it's an important story to tell about a part of America and something that's going on and about class and trust and connection and sex. And it's, to me, ownership of stories. I've never liked that. I don't appreciate that. I think you get to tell whatever story you want to tell and tell it well, and it'll be fine.
The results will speak for themselves. Are you saying that Sean Baker was actually the son of a Russian oligarch, and so he was trying to tell the opposite story of his life?
Exactly. See, he wasn't even that, and he was put that in his movie. Unbelievable. I think I would recommend, it's hard with this book because I think it is kind of singular in a lot of ways, but I would definitely recommend if you liked this book, reading some more Kingsolver, and I would start with Poisonwood Bible. I mentioned it earlier, but yeah, it's a really interesting book, very, very lush. I have not read it in a really long time, but it was the first book I read of hers that I completely fell in love with. So I would definitely recommend that, and has big themes, but also is really tight into this one family too, which I think she's so good at. The other book that I thought, which is very different, but similar in idea, is that it's A Gentleman in Moscow, because it's this rich character study, but in a really well-developed setting, in a certain time and place that it has to be in that time and place to make sense. And you spend most of the story inside one man's head, which I think is very similar to this book in that way.
That's interesting. I hadn't thought about that, but that's a really good call.
Strangely, another book where you see a child develop and grow up, and
Yes.
it's not specifically from Nina's perspective in any way, but like you see her grow up and evolve, and the voice feels very authentic. That's a very colorful novel about a part of the world that I just don't think a lot of people are reading about. That's a good call.
Yeah. RJ, do you have any comps for us?
No,
Perfect.
I don't. I wish I
Well-
did. But I can't think of any. It's like too because of all the things, mostly thinking about it from that like shifting of perspective and like all that stuff. I just think it's like it's hard to think of another book that does something similar. But I like the Gentleman in Moscow idea.
Can we make a Lonesome Dove comp? I think there's a way to do it. Just
Always, right?
America, rural America, trying to grow and evolve and figure
Wow.
itself out, and some pokes. That happens in Demon
Yep.
Copperhead as well.
Yep.
No,
And someday I'll read this book so I can actually be participating in these conversations. I don't know why I've dragged my feet on it, but I've already read some very long books this year, so I feel like I need to like pause on my long books. It's
well,
long,
Lonesome
no?
Dove is going to be library card. What, April 1st? Is that what we're saying, RJ? So Meg's got to get on it.
You gotta start.
It's so cruel.
Start now. You gotta start now.
We have our next book
yeah.
picked though.
Yeah, do we?
Yeah,
Good
we
for us.
do. Yeah.
Do we?
In a few weeks, we're gonna be reading talking about James by
Oh,
Percival Everett,
man.
which
Unbelievable.
I'm excited to talk about this book because I think there's some a little variety in our I don't know in how we kind of interpreted this book. So I'm excited about it.
Yeah, man.
I'm very
RJ
excited to
sound-
dive into this. I think that we're gonna have a lot of we'll have varying opinions, and I think that's a good thing. If you liked our varying opinions episode, listen to our Claire and the Sun episode from a couple weeks ago.
Yeah.
I think that's where we get into really interesting discussions and can hear each other's opinions and differences of what they take in from a book versus other people, and I think that's fascinating.
Yeah, it's going to be great. That
it's
another
gonna be really
book
fun.
inspired by a classic piece of literature.
Yeah, that's a man. What a great book. We're talking about great books. Good for us.
Yeah,
That's
this
the
is
point of
really
the pod.
fun. So that's
Yeah.
actually why we're here. Oh my
No,
god, it's
I
so
can
great.
suggest some bad ones if you guys want. We could talk about bad books. That'd be
No,
fun.
that's all right. That's all right. We have enough to read
Okay.
without bad books. Yeah, I think we've got our hands full. And thanks everyone for joining us. I'm really excited about this conversation. And thanks for talking about the criticism. And even though it's all bullshit, we appreciate digging into it and thinking about how we know more than critics. It's exciting. Feels good. So we'll see everyone in a few weeks for James by Percival Everett. And thanks for joining us. We'll see you guys later.
Bye.